Hello, and welcome to today's exploration of one of the most pivotal events of the 20th century, the Russian Revolution. I'm absolutely fascinated by this period, as it represents a seismic shift not just in Russian history, but in the course of world events. The revolution, which unfolded between 1917 and 1923, saw the collapse of the centuries-old Romanov dynasty and the birth of the world's first socialist state. It's a tale of political intrigue, social upheaval, and ideological warfare that continues to shape our world today. As we delve into this complex and often misunderstood period, I want us to consider not just the events themselves, but their far-reaching consequences. The Russian Revolution wasn't just about Russia. It sparked a wave of revolutionary sentiment across Europe and beyond, fundamentally altering the global balance of power. It's a story of how a nation, pushed to breaking point by war, inequality and autocratic rule, erupted into a cauldron of revolutionary fervour that would ultimately give birth to the Soviet Union. The Russian Revolution can also be seen as the precursor for the other European revolutions that occurred during or in the aftermath of World War I, such as the German Revolution of 1918-1919. To understand the revolution, we need to first examine the powder keg that was Russia in the early 20th century. The country was a patchwork of contradictions, a vast empire spanning 1/6 of the world's landmass, yet plagued by backwardness and inequality. At the top sat Tsar Nicholas II, the last of the Romanov dynasty, ruling as an autocrat in an age of rising democratic sentiment. I've always found Nicholas a tragic figure, well-meaning but woefully out of touch with the realities of his rapidly changing empire. The social structure of Russia was a tinderbox waiting for a spark. The vast majority of the population were peasants, living in conditions that had changed little since medieval times. A small but growing urban working class faced appalling conditions in the factories springing up in cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow. Meanwhile, a tiny elite of nobles and industrialists enjoyed enormous wealth and privilege. This stark inequality was becoming increasingly untenable in an age of rising literacy and political awareness. Russia consisted mainly of poor farming peasants and substantial inequality of land ownership, with 1.5% of the population owning 25% of the land. The catalyst that would ignite this powder keg was World War I. Russia entered the war in 1914 with a wave of patriotic fervour, but the reality of modern warfare soon shattered any illusions of glory. The Russian army, despite its size, was poorly equipped and led. Defeats mounted, casualties soared, and the home front began to buckle under the strain of total war. Food shortages became commonplace, inflation spiralled out of control, and public anger grew. It's a stark reminder of how quickly the fortunes of a great power can change when faced with the pressures of modern warfare. The spark that lit the revolutionary flame came in February 1917, or March by the Gregorian calendar used in the West. What began as a series of strikes and protests in Petrograd, as St. Petersburg was then known, quickly spiralled into a full-scale uprising. I'm always struck by how quickly events unfolded. Within a matter of days, centuries of Romanov rule came crashing down. The key moment came when the army, sent to suppress the protests, began to mutiny. Soldiers, many of them peasants in uniform, refused to fire on the crowds and instead joined the revolution. This left Nicholas II with no choice but to abdicate, bringing to an end 300 years of Romanov rule. It's a powerful reminder of how quickly seemingly unshakable regimes can crumble when they lose the loyalty of their armed forces. To quell the riots, the Tsar looked to the army. At least 180,000 troops were available in the capital, but most were either untrained or injured. Historian Ian Beckett suggests around 12,000 could be regarded as reliable, but even these proved reluctant to move in on the crowd since it included so many women. In the wake of the Tsar's abdication, a provisional government was formed, largely composed of liberal politicians from the Duma, Russia's parliament. However, real power increasingly lay with the Petrograd Soviet, a council of workers' and soldiers' deputies. This created a situation of dual power, with the provisional government and the Soviet both claiming authority. It's a fascinating period of political experimentation, but one that was ultimately unsustainable. The provisional government, led by Alexander Kerensky, found itself caught between the demands of the radicalized masses and the need to continue the war effort, a balancing act that would prove impossible to maintain. Into this volatile situation stepped Vladimir Lenin, the leader of the Bolshevik faction of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party. Lenin had been in exile in Switzerland when the February Revolution broke out, but he quickly made his way back to Russia, famously travelling in a sealed train provided by the German government. I've always found Lenin a compelling figure, a brilliant political tactician with an unwavering commitment to his revolutionary ideals. Upon his return to Russia in April 1917, Lenin issued his famous April Theses, calling for all power to the Soviets and an immediate end to Russian participation in the war. This was a radical position, even within the Bolshevik Party, but Lenin's forceful personality and clear vision gradually won over the majority. The Bolsheviks' promise of peace, land, and bread resonated powerfully with a population exhausted by war and hunger. With Lenin's arrival, the popularity of the Bolsheviks increased steadily. Over the course of the spring, public dissatisfaction with the provisional government and the war, in particular among workers, soldiers and peasants, pushed these groups to radical parties. Throughout the summer and autumn of 1917, the Bolsheviks grew in strength, particularly in the urban Soviets. The failure of the provisional government's military offensive in June, known as the Kerensky Offensive, further discredited the government and boosted support for the Bolsheviks' anti-war stance. By October, the stage was set for the Bolsheviks to make their move. Lenin, against the objections of some of his closest allies, pushed for an armed insurrection to overthrow the provisional government. The October Revolution, which actually took place in November by our calendar, was a remarkably bloodless affair. On the night of November 7th, Bolshevik Red Guards, led by Leon Trotsky, seized key points throughout Petrograd. The following day they stormed the Winter Palace, the seat of the provisional government. Kerensky fled, and the Bolsheviks were left in control of the capital. It's striking how little resistance they faced, a testament to how thoroughly discredited the provisional government had become. With power in their hands, the Bolsheviks moved quickly to implement their program. They issued decrees on peace and land, calling for an immediate end to the war and the redistribution of land to the peasants. They also established a new government, the Council of People's Commissars, with Lenin at its head. It's important to note that at this point, the Bolsheviks saw their revolution as just the first step in a worldwide proletarian revolution. They genuinely believed that workers across Europe would soon follow their example. Lenin did not believe that a socialist revolution necessarily presupposed a fully developed capitalist economy. A semi-capitalist country would suffice, and Russia had a working-class base of 5% of the population. However, the Bolsheviks' hold on power was far from secure. Many Russians, including other socialist parties, opposed their seizure of power. When elections were held for a constituent assembly in November, the Bolsheviks won only a quarter of the vote. Their response was to forcibly dissolve the assembly when it met in January 1918. This marked a crucial turning point. The Bolsheviks had shown they were willing to use force to maintain their rule, setting the stage for the authoritarian regime that would follow. The Bolshevik seizure of power marked the beginning, not the end, of the Russian Revolution. Almost immediately they faced armed opposition from a diverse coalition known as the Whites, which included everyone from monarchists and liberals to moderate socialists. What followed was a brutal civil war that lasted until 1923. The level of violence and suffering during this period was staggering, with millions dying from combat, disease and famine. Despite facing seemingly overwhelming odds, with the Whites receiving support from foreign powers including Britain, France and the United States, the Bolsheviks ultimately emerged victorious. There were several reasons for this. The Bolsheviks controlled the industrial heartland of Russia, giving them access to weapons and supplies. They also had a clear, if brutal, ideological vision, whereas the Whites were a fractious coalition, united only by their opposition to Bolshevism. Perhaps most importantly, the Bolsheviks were able to present themselves as defenders of the Russian nation against foreign intervention, winning over many who might otherwise have opposed them. The Bolsheviks firstly assumed power in Petrograd, expanding their rule outwards. They eventually reached the easterly Siberian Russian coast in Vladivostok, 4 years after the war began, an occupation that is believed to have ended all significant military campaigns in the nation. The civil war had a profound impact on the nature of the Bolshevik regime. The exigencies of war led to the policy of war communism, involving the forced requisitioning of grain from peasants and the nationalization of all large-scale industry. While these measures helped win the war, they also bred resentment and economic chaos. The Bolsheviks also became increasingly intolerant of dissent, banning all other political parties and establishing the Cheka, a secret police force to root out counter-revolutionaries. By the time the Civil War ended, the ideals of worker democracy that had animated the revolution had largely given way to a one-party dictatorship. As we look back on the Russian Revolution from our vantage point today, it's hard to overstate its impact on world history. It led to the creation of the Soviet Union, a superpower that would shape global politics for most of the 20th century. The revolution inspired communist movements around the world, from China to Cuba, fundamentally altering the course of the Cold War and decolonization. Even today, more than 30 years after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the echoes of 1917 continue to resonate. Yet the legacy of the revolution is deeply ambiguous. While it brought about significant social and economic changes, including advances in education, women's rights, and industrialization, it also led to political repression, economic hardship, and the loss of millions of lives. The revolution's promise of a workers' paradise gave way to the reality of Stalin's totalitarian regime. It's a stark reminder of how revolutions, however noble their initial intentions, can often lead to outcomes far removed from their original goals. The RSFSR and later the Soviet Union continued to practice political repression until its dissolution in 1991. As a historian, I find the Russian Revolution endlessly fascinating. It raises profound questions about the nature of social change, the role of individuals in shaping history, and the tensions between idealism and pragmatism in politics. It serves as a cautionary tale about the dangers of utopianism and the unintended consequences of radical change. Yet it also reminds us of the power of ideas to mobilize people and transform societies. As we continue to grapple with issues of inequality, political representation, and social justice in our own time, the lessons of 1917 remain as relevant as ever. Thank you for joining me on this journey through one of the most pivotal events of the 20th century. The Russian Revolution continues to fascinate and divide historians and the public alike, and I hope this exploration has given you a deeper understanding of its complexities and enduring significance. If you've enjoyed this video, please consider liking, subscribing, and sharing your thoughts in the comments. Your engagement truly helps support the channel and shape future content. Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep learning from the lessons of history.